Bom, boa tarde a todos, sejam bem-vindos. Mais um encontro do Teaços. Hoje a gente vai ter a grande alegria de receber Laurence Hillman. Um grande prazer receber o Laurence. Vou fazer a apresentação dele como a gente sempre faz, uma apresentação formal. O Laurence é nascido e criado em Zurique, na Suíça. Ele emergiu nos arquétipos aos 16 anos, e essa continua sendo a sua paixão por mais de 40 anos. Em seu papel de consultor, ele ajuda líderes e organizações a entender seus padrões arquetípicos e aconselha sobre a tomada de decisões de alto nível nas organizações. Suas ferramentas para mapear os arquétipos incluem a astrologia arquetípica, em relação à qual é uma das principais vozes em todo o mundo. Ele lecionou internacionalmente e realizou workshops no Globe Theatre, em Londres, onde misturou Shakespeare e astrologia, na Cycles and Symbols Conference, na Califórnia, deu uma palestra sobre Vênus na América, co-apresentada com seu pai, James Hillman. Também lecionou na Escola de Mistério. Também lecionou na Escola de Mistério de Jim Houston, na Pacifica Graduate, e tem sido diversas vezes palestrante convidado na Universidade de Washington e St. Louis. Ele é autor de Como Reimaginar Sua Vida através da linguagem da astrologia, Alinhamentos, Como Viver em Harmonia com o Universo, e também Arquétipos em Ação, Evoluindo Sua História, um personagem de cada vez. Laurence, um prazer te receber. A gente havia feito o convite ano passado, só que a gente teve um problema de datas, não pudemos realizá-lo, e você muito gentilmente atendeu ao nosso segundo convite para você vir aqui falar conosco. Prazer te receber, não é a primeira vez que você fala com o público brasileiro, né? A gente estava conversando antes, você já esteve em Campinas, aqui em 2013, se eu não me engano. E, enfim, sinta-se à vontade, para nós é uma grande alegria, um grande prazer te receber. A casa é tua, fique completamente confortável. Obrigado pela tua presença.
Thank you very much, Isa. Hello, everybody. It is a great pleasure to be here. I should maybe say again, because yes, I did speak in Campinas back in 10 years ago. So I'm delighted to be back and to talk to you about more recent work that I've been doing since then, and about how the Jungian way of thinking of inner multiplicity and richness of an inner life, the difference to mainstream psychology and the importance of this other way that Jung brought us in a world that is still so incredibly linear and where those models are failing us. I find it really interesting how Jung has become incredibly popular. Not just Jung, but right brain thinking and imagination and creativity have taken on a whole new level of importance in a complex world. And people are simply hungry, really hungry for meaning making. And so much of what is typically offered in psychology, also in my field of leadership development, is simply not feeding people in a way that is soulful, and that has great price, and people are looking for other ways. And so I'm also encouraging you, if you have any opportunities to do leadership work, there's such a great need in the leadership world to speak soul to leaders, that you have a unique skill set by having that mindset that you have by being Jungians. So I'm encouraging you as well, and I will show you a model that we use when we work with organizations, just to briefly touch on it. It's also an invitation to join a growing group of people who are doing soul work in organizations, and we're always looking for others who have this passion, because I started this newer work by asking myself, well, you know, where do you really make a difference in the world? Where is the power? And the power in the world has never really been with politicians. It's always been with where the money is. And so in that way, I decided to become an expert on leadership psychology and work with leaders, because I figured if I could make a difference in one leader, I could make a difference in 10,000 people's lives. And so we're now doing that, and it's an extraordinary experience to be, to have a say in helping leadership develop new ways of working with people. And it doesn't matter what kind of an organization. It can be corporate, it can be nonprofit, it can be religious, whatever the organization is, we organize ourselves into organizations. And there's leadership models about that. And that's something I'm really interested in, how we spread it forward and how we work with other people. So let's get into the presentation. I don't know how long it is, but I'm going to guess maybe 45 minutes or so, maybe a little longer. And then I'll stay on until the last person stops asking questions. So I'm in Paris right now. I live in St. Louis, Missouri, in the middle of the United States. So it is, what is it, about 9:15 in the evening here. And I'm excited to be here with you and just offer you what I have, what I think about, and to see where the conversation takes us. So you should be seeing the full screen now, yes. And so what we're talking about today, the title is, Jung obviously was one of the first presenters of the notion of what I call the polypoetic psyche, of a psyche that is multiple, that has many gods, many parts, many inner figures. And so we probably all agree that that is how the psyche is built, if you want to use that word. But then the question is, how do we interact with that? Jungians would probably say through dreams or through active imagination or these kinds of tools. And so we're asking that question: how do we interact with this polypoetic psyche? And so I'll start in the first question is, how do we see the mind in this conversation today? How do we look about the mind? And when I say mind, you can interchange that word with psyche, with inner life, with what's going on inside of you, different ways that we try to call this inner sense of who am I? The model of the mind that we have is that we have a conscious part of the mind. I'm aware of what I'm saying to you right now. And then we have an unconscious part of what's going on right now. I'm unaware of certain things that are also going on in myself at this time. And depth psychology that you're all interested in focuses primarily on the nature and role of the unconscious, of that which we don't know. And then Freud and Jung, I'm being very general here and very simple, but just to bring us all on this to the same place, postulated the existence of this unconscious. There was a part of us that we were not aware of that actually had a lot to say about what's going on in our everyday thinking. And then neuroscience caught up with all of that eventually and showed us that most of what we do is actually unconscious. Very little of what we do is conscious. Jung first spoke of a universal repository, that there was this place where archetypes exist. I like to think of it as a large ocean. That's always been my image of it, the universal repository of archetypes. And then my father, with archetypal psychology, was the founding voice of that, kind of took it to the next level of thinking, how does this apply even more in a psychological context to to the analytical room. What we also got from Jung is that there's two kinds of unconscious. There's not just the personal unconscious, but also the collective unconscious. So the personal unconscious, that I'm not aware right now of what else is going on in my mind. The collective unconscious, that I'm not maybe at this moment tuned in that much to the collective, that I can also tune into in my dreams or in my active imagination, or just by sitting still. And what we teach is that, of course, awareness of what is unconscious allows for personal development. You will notice that I use the word development in this presentation. I remember that my father would have, a strong reaction to the word development, because developmental psychology was like, the no. And I think that's a mistake. So the model that we work with is both archetypal and developmental. Essentially, one could easily argue that Jung's notion of individuation is a developmental model. And so we shouldn't, fight about stuff like that. I'm just telling you how I'm using the term. becoming aware of what we don't know about ourselves is the potential to develop. It's just a word in it. Let's just use it as an English word of development, whatever that is in Portuguese. And also, what is unconscious to us shows us where we actually have the most to learn. And that is the usefulness of thinking in a more inclusive way than saying it's one or the other. So the collective unconscious essentially is a universally shared repository of archetypes. That's what's in there. Archetypes are universal images, you could call them that. Plato called them images. Kant had a word for them, Schopenhauer had a word for them. This is through philosophy, there's been this idea that there are key core ideas that are universal. Easy examples for us all to understand are mother, child, warrior, or three archetypes that most people, wherever you go in the world, will recognize. And so they are out there, they're floating around in the collective unconscious, but then we personalize them and they appear in us because we express what we collectively inherit, and the child becomes the inner child, the mother becomes our inner mother, and the warrior becomes our inner warrior. So we make them internal. So we have sort of these figures that are floating around within us, one could imagine. That's the archetypal model of the mind. So archetypes are collectively inherited and then personally expressed. That is the key idea. I have called the archetypes the genome of the soul, because it is in a world where, particularly in organizations, I don't know how it is in Brazil, but in the United States, this is a huge issue right now. Maybe the top issue for most leaders is how to fight inequity, diversity, and how to increase diversity, fight inequity, and bring more inclusion. This is one of the top issues that corporations are dealing with on a big scale. Lots of lawsuits and fights and problems like that. And so imagine, the idea that actually we all share these archetypes. It doesn't matter where you go in the world. This was one of Jung's greatest gifts. We all have the same archetypes. So they are, in a way, just like we all have the same genome, no matter where you go in the world. Sure, there's different expressions and slight changes here and there, but essentially we're all the same. So we're looking at something with archetypes that is a human experience, that is not gendered, that is not skin color, that is not language-based, that is not anything except being a human. And maybe even in animals, we don't know. But we know for sure that archetypes in that sense are what connect us, and are in that sense, I think of them as a genome, is what connects us all. So the traditional model of how most of psychology thinks about the mind and a person is that there's a me, there's an I, there's an ego, there's a self. It's a mono model, a singular mono model. That's what develops in developmental psychology. First I crawl, then I walk, and then I run. So I, me, the crawler, walker, runner is developing. There's a singular model of an I. What we're doing is, this is a line from Walt Whitman, a poem from a famous American poet, that has one line and says, "I contain multitudes," which is actually, if you think about it, how we experience ourselves. Who in this room hasn't said in their lives, a part of me wants to do this, but another part of me wants to do that. We have conversations with ourselves internally all the time, which we cannot do if there's a singular I. So the model that we are practicing, if you're a Jungian or doing something with archetypes, is a model of poly. That's where the word polypoetic comes from, the idea that it's multiple. So here's a practical example. We're all going to just do a little example of how I explain archetypes to people who have absolutely no idea what they are. I think of a 3-layered cake. I like chocolate, so this is a 3-layered chocolate cake. On the top layer, we have the behavior, what we can watch a person do. So the practical example here is, I'm always angry. That's something I can observe. It's a behavior. I can observe it. I can repeat it. I can duplicate it. I can measure it, in blood pressure and other things. So The behavior is the top layer. It's what we see. Most people stay there. They don't ask any questions. They just observe behavior and respond to behavior. Psychology would then ask, why? And there are different answers. Somebody might say, I had an angry parent, or something like that. You could use a different lens in the middle of the cake. You could say a historical level. You could say right now, everybody in the world is very angry because we have so much division in the world. So people are really angry at this time in history. That will be a different lens, but you're asking the same question, why am I always angry? We live in angry times will be historical answer. I had an angry parent will be the typical psychological explanation of a developmentalist, for instance. As an archetypal thinker, we ask the question differently. We would simply say, my warrior is easily activated. Warrior is a universal archetype. And it explains the behavior and skips over the psychology. We don't really care why. We just know, we observe and we describe through an archetypal lens what the behavior is. That's it. That's the archetypal model. So if you think of the three-layered cake, you use the deepest layer to understand what archetype is here. My father used to say, who is here? Who is here when you have a situation? Obviously, if you're doing dream analysis, you can ask who is here in the dream. You don't take necessarily the literal dream image. You take who is here, and you might use story or mythology or whatever your model is that you use to explain the non-literal, to understand the behavior. So this quick exercise, just take, you're all experts, you've all done, a lot of analysis yourselves, I'm sure. Write down something that you do. I'll just do 30 seconds of this. Write down something you often do. Underneath it, explain why through the psychological lens. And then ask yourself, what archetype do you think gets activated here? To think a little differently. And we don't have to share this. This is just for yourself. And we won't do 5 minutes. We don't have the time. Just I want you to start thinking in the model that I'm presenting. Something you do. One of the things you'll notice is that a lot of judgment goes away when we look at things archetypally. Let's take an example. Somebody says, I lie a lot, because that's a behavior, right? I tell lies. So psychology would say, well, you're insecure, or you're trying to make yourself look better, or you're afraid of the truth, or whatever. Get some psychological explanation. The archetype would maybe say, Mercury or the trickster or Hermes is very active in your mind. It's a trickster. It's an archetype. So the judgment goes away. It doesn't mean we think every behavior is acceptable, but it means that we stop judging it because we're simply looking at who's here. Now we can decide what to do with it. It's a different way of thinking, and it's very important because we live in a world where people don't want to be judged or be put in boxes or labeled. So the next very important piece for this presentation, to me, maybe the key of everything, we were just first talking about what kind of a mind are we using. I'm now introducing a term that I call the yin function. This is a term that is a mixture of yin and yang, and function is essentially borrowing from Jung's typology, making a new function, the function of yin. So the function of yin, I'm going to explain what I mean with that. If I explain yin and yang to a child, I will tell them that yang is when we're all walking in a straight line, we're going somewhere, but we're only seeing the back of the person ahead of us. No connection, but we're moving. Yin is when we're all in a circle where everybody's connecting, but we're not going anywhere. Right? So those are the two sort of main ways of being. Another term that we need in this context, and you'll see how this all fits together in a moment, is that the world that we have lived in for many, 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 many years has been complicated. An example of a complicated world, let's take a complicated system, is a car. A car is made up of a lot of simple parts. For instance, there's a steering system that is a wheel and a couple of rods and some and some lubrication, and when you turn the wheel, the wheels move. So each part of the complicated car is actually quite simple. And if something breaks in the car, then we can fix the broken part and the car works again. So all parts are known. Behavior is predictable. If I turn the wheel to the left, the car will go to the left, and it's linear. When I press the gas, the engine goes, I move forward. That's a complicated system. But what has happened in the world, because of evolvement of human race and just the universality of everything and global and everything being global, we now have a new quality in reality that's called emergence. And therefore, complicated is no longer how we see the world, but we actually now live in a complex world. So the difference between complicated and complex is emergence. Emergence means that in a complex world, some things are known, but some things are not known. Examples of a complex world or a complex moment with emergence is 9/11, COVID, the war in Ukraine, the current situation in the Middle East. These are unexpected, emergent moments that change everything overnight. If you're in business or you're doing any kind of work today, we are all connected. 92% of the human race is currently on a smartphone, 92%. So with 8.5 billion people, that means technically, you are right now, technically, connected to over 7 billion people. And so anything that emerges like COVID changes everybody's life overnight. And we will have more and more emerging events that changes how you do business. So imagine if you're a leader, this will change your supply line, this will change your workforce, it'll change all kinds of things if you're a leader. And as a creative person, suddenly something emerges like AI, changes everything overnight. So these things are happening very, very quickly, and we need this word that I've written up in the top right corner, which is the most important word that I will bring to you tonight, I think, or idea, which is complexity capability. How does the human being deal with complexity? Complexity capability is the human ability to manage complexity. That's what we're talking about here. And the argument that I'm going to make tonight is that Jungian thought is particularly suited to develop complexity capability. That's my argument. And I'll show you how. So yin yang can also be described in this way: left brain and right brain. Now, I am very aware that this is not a biological fact. There are no left brain people who have a certain kind of a brain and right brain people with a different kind of a brain. This is not biological, but it is a very good shorthand, a very useful term that everyone in the business world or in any other world immediately understands. So we're going to use that term as a shorthand, not as a literalism and not as a biological fact. So the words on the left brain words, have been the dominant way that human beings have organized, that power has been distributed, that the culture has been run. And in this crowd, we can even use the word masculine and feminine for these two, because you understand what we mean with that. Although in the business setting, those are dangerous words, which is why I use yin instead of feminine. So these are the skills. So right brain capabilities essentially means using this part of the brain. Now, here's a practical example that I like to use when I work with, especially with male leaders who don't think they need their right brain. I have a client and a friend now who was a F-16 fighter pilot. For many men, that is like the ultimate dream, right? So he's a good example to use with a male leader. He flew combat and he flew fighter jet, colonel in the US Air Force. when I met him 20 years ago, I asked him, I said, when you're flying a plane at tremendous speeds, 6 different directions, up, down, left, right, front, back, with very, very deadly weapons at your fingertips, 3 bad guys in front of you, 2 good guys behind you, it cannot be that you are operating this tool with your left brain. Can't be. It's too complex. And I thought either he's never going to talk to me again and think I'm stupid, or we'll have a conversation. And he immediately said to me, oh, I know exactly what you mean. I had 2 professors in War College, where he went, that talked about this all the time. If I want to survive in the air in a fight, I need to use my feminine brain. That's what he said. So I would argue here that this man understands right brain capabilities and understands complexity capability, because what he does is incredibly complex. You can't do that linearly. You can't think logically. The next thing I'm going to do is this, because there's too much. He needs his imagination. He needs to think holistically. He needs to do things simultaneously and not successively. And he needs to think of the big picture. This is exactly what right brain capability can do. This is a beautiful example. This is a brain health clinic in Las Vegas, a real building that was built specifically to show left brain, right brain. I kind of like this. You can see left brain, the logical part, the office part is on the left, and the right brain, the imaginal and creative side is on the right. So this is a building that literally does brain hemispheres in its architecture. I just thought it was a nice example. And it's a brain health clinic, so I like that. So to sum up, the definition that we're using is that the yin function is a person's complexity capability, which is the same as their right brain capacity or capability. You can exchange these words. A simple way that we could put it is we could say the yin function is a person's capacity to access their feminine side. That would be how we would say it if we were having a dinner conversation with somebody. And here's what's very, very important. This is not gendered. I know plenty of people who have, I know plenty of men who have a very high yin function, and I know plenty of women who have a very low yin function. So it has nothing to do with gender. It has everything to do with the capacity to access your right brain. If you are working as Jungian analysts or as Jungians in some capacity, you are already extremely well schooled and well trained in using your right brain, because you couldn't do the work otherwise. So this is all, known to you. And maybe it's just a reminder of the importance of this. And I'm putting it now into perspective of the modern world and complexity that is coming. This was my argument in the beginning when I said the world is getting increasingly complex. Therefore, the skills that you have and use with your patients or the people that you work with in some capacity are very much in need of what you have to offer. It makes what you do much more relevant than it was in the 1980s, when things were very linear. So to recap this part, the archetypal perspective recognizes the psyche's multiplicity. We are peopled inside. We have different parts of us, characters, inner voices, whatever you want to call them. And the modern world requires right brain capabilities. That was my point so far. So if we agree to this, then we can say, all right, so how do we map these archetypes? There's all these archetypes going around in our head or in our psyche or wherever they are. How do we map them? How do we actually make them visible so other people can understand them and recognize them? How do we do that? How do we make this inner child, inner mother, inner warrior, and so forth? And how do we do that? How do we map them? So in your work, you might use fairy tales, dreams, There is a very fast-growing psychological movement called internal family systems. I'm sure you've heard of it. Systemic constellations and archetypal astrology, all of them create patterns and make visible the archetypes so that we have something we can work with and not just talk about a theory. In the model that I will show you for archetypal astrology, since I'm an astrologer, is I use the idea of an inner stage. People are very familiar with theater. Again, doesn't matter where you go. Everybody can imagine a theater, can imagine, that they are stepping into a certain role. If I get angry, I step into my warrior. If I'm lying, I step into my trickster. If I'm telling a story, I step into my storyteller, and so on. We can relate to this. It's very natural wherever you go. So I'm going to use the stage as an image. Onto the stage, I'm going to put 10 archetypes. Why 10? There's endless archetypes because astrology uses 10 planets. And we can get into that conversation separately if you're interested, but astrology uses 10 planets. And they represent 10 parts of us, or 10 universal figures that are universally recognized, that have been used longer than any other system, over 5,000 years, since the Babylonians. And just like in music, you can play any song with 12 keys on the piano. 7 white, 5 black keys, and you can play any melody. Same thing. With these 10 archetypes, you can tell any story, explain any situation, and I can promise you that. You'll have to believe me on that because I can't prove that, but I can tell you that I've done this for 46 years. And with these 10, I've never come across a situation where I couldn't immediately understand what archetype is at work here, what archetype is being activated. So it's a full set. We don't need more. And no matter where you are or where you're born, everybody is born under a sky of these same 10 planets. So it's a universal, immediately understood idea. And every major culture throughout history has, of course, created its own astrology. Jung was a big astrologer. There's a fabulous new book out now about Jung's astrology by Liz Green, a 2-volume book that's fantastic. So there is, it's nothing new to bring astrology into Jungian thought. And then we can simply make this a little bit more literal and say they represent a story that is drawn up in the chart. So we talk about the 10 astrological archetypes in this model. It's a model. It's not the truth. It's a way to understand something that's very difficult to understand. And so in very short form, this is what these 10 represent. The sun tells you who you, sort of the sense, it says, I am on the stage. Saturn says, I focus. The moon says, I need. And you can sort of see what they say as actors on a stage. This is now looking at the stage from above. And this is the chart for Brasilia today when this lecture started. So you can take any moment in time and you can look at it and it tells you a story if you know how to read this. So for you, unless you know astrology, you see a bunch of lines and dots and doesn't mean anything. If you look at a piece of sheet music, a bunch of lines and dots, black on white, and it means nothing unless you know how to read music and it's like, wow, this is beautiful, right? So I look at this and I say, wow, this is beautiful because I've been reading this for 46 years. It's like maybe reading Chinese for someone who doesn't know how to read Chinese. So you can see that it is simply a language that translates the sky into a story. On my website here, you can download this page. It's one page that gives you a bunch of keywords for each of them if you want to play with these and get ideas. Even when you do dream interpretation, who is here? You can ask by saying, I had a very passionate dream. Okay, who is here when I have a passionate dream? Well, passion belongs to Mars. So maybe Mars was here. I wonder about that. You can start to play with this very practically. You can download this from my website. Keywords for the 10 astrological archetypes. So a new term we need to know. Each archetype expresses itself on a spectrum. So both of these pictures, both of these hands are expressing the warrior, Mars up here, Mars, the warrior. But they're very different. And so sometimes when I teach this, I put up this picture and I say, how are you expressing your warrior? Which one of these is you, or where on the scale between the two are you? It's still the archetype. There's no judgment with the fact that it's the warrior. What you do with it, that's free will. That's where you have a choice. So again, on this warrior scale, we have an optimal zone sort of in the middle. That's where we want to be. That's where the warrior, where we can defend ourselves, we can stand up for ourselves. People don't walk over us in a meeting. We can be firm, we can get what we ask for, and so forth. If we have too much warrior, then we become a bully and we scream at people and we're angry all the time. If we don't have enough warrior, then people walk all over us and treat us badly, or even worse, physical abuse. So there's this optimal zone for each of them. And here's some words that belong to the warrior. And so if you read these to get a sense of how your warrior is, you might say, well, I look at these and yes, these are true for me and these are not true, right? And what we see immediately with this model is that, like, I don't plant seeds, I don't take risks. I have a good sense of where I'm going. I have direction. I take action. I like a good challenge, but I'm not brave. I'm not fierce. So some of them work and some of them don't work, let's say, just as an example. Where you didn't check the boxes, where you didn't say yes, like fearless, you'd said, nope, somebody said no on fearless, not me. That is where you can grow. That's where you can grow the warrior, by becoming more fearless. So what might you do to become more fearless? That would be the therapeutic path, by understanding it in this detailed kind of way. There's two kinds of development. Now we're bringing development again. Again, this model is both archetypal and developmental. Horizontal development means walking towards an archetype on the stage that I don't know very much about. Having done this work now with lots of people and in organizations, many women, that's cultural, aren't very comfortable with their warrior. If you're a therapist, I'm sure you've met that as well. Many men are not comfortable with their nurture, for instance, with this part, you know, the embrace, or with the feelings. And so horizontal development means walking towards and developing an archetype that you are very uncomfortable with for whatever reason. We don't have to know why. Vertical development means saying, yeah, I know my warrior very well, but I scream all the time. So that would mean up, you know, turning up or turning down the volume of a particular archetype. Those are two different ways of developing. So let's use Jung's idea of complex to see how this would work as a healing model. We can define the complex as a couple of different things. I like the definition of a bruise in the psyche. I got that from Elizabeth Nelson at Pacifica. That's a lovely term. It indicates usually an old injury. It lasts a lifetime, can help make meaning. It's a tender spot. All these things you all know about this, but there's always an archetypal core. So I'm going to show you how we can use this model to deal with Jung's notion of a complex. Everyone I've ever met, including me, has a pile of doo-doo on their hand. We all do. It's a technical term. We all do. It's called something. It's why we go for help. It's why we are suffering. It's why something is, you know, I've never met anyone who's perfect. I have it. You have it. That's human nature. And so one of my teachers once said, if we have a pile of doo-doo on our hand and we stir it up, you know, we talk about it. Oh, I have all this. I want to talk about it. It stinks. It just stinks because you're talking about things you can't change. They happen. And so this is the model for healing with archetypes. First, let's say this is what is the presentation, right? Let's say somebody comes with you with any of these. I'm shy and lonely, I don't have any friends, I'm afraid of my feelings, I'm emotionally stuck, I had a controlling mother, I had a heavy childhood, I'm overly protective. For someone with a developed archetypal eye, an astrologically developed archetypal eye because of those particular archetypes, you would immediately recognize that in all of these stories are the same two archetypes. This is a Saturn moon story. Now, to make that translation, you have to be able to speak astrological archetypes. That's the training. But once you have that, you can immediately recognize what's going on. It's a Saturn moon story of all of those. Literally in the language, you can take these words directly off that sheet that I gave you to download if you're interested. And you'll find right away, okay, it's a Saturn moon story. Now, what do we do? So now we ask the patient, or the client in my case, how would you like to live your Saturn moon? We know it is a key in your life. It's been there since the beginning. Now, Saturn moon together can do a lot of great things. It is really good for building houses for, abused women or something like that, or organizing children's lives in some way, teaching, all kinds of things. There's lots of great things you can do. You go to that cheat sheet, you find words for Saturn and for the moon, and you make up all kinds of ideas based on those key words that would be a productive thing to do with Saturn and the moon, something useful and helpful for the person. Once you put that on the hand and you start focusing on how you want to live Saturn moon, two things happen. This becomes less important, but we are not ignoring the past. We're not ignoring the history. This is the key. Because while we're no longer looking at the history in the past, we are staying with the archetypal pattern that caused the history in the past. This is the key right here. You're not ignoring the problem. You are dealing with it on an archetypal level, not on a literal level of what the previous expression was of Saturn moon, which could be, again, stirring up the old. The complex is the weakest link. It's the vulnerability, it's the stress point. And we can simply ask, which of my archetypes do I tend to overplay? Too much warrior, I showed you, or too little, not enough. And we can use this model very quickly to know where to apply some healing energy. So lastly, finally, I have no idea what time it is, perfect time. So there is this concept now, I talked about left and right brain leadership. There is a concept now that it's being thrown around, a lot of Harvard Review articles. If you Google the term full brain leadership, you'll get a lot of different articles. This is a popular idea. It's not my idea. It's been around for a long time. There have been other models that try to bring in a more right brain way of doing leadership, but nobody ever talks about the full brain. It's always like we have to be more here or more here, as opposed to the whole thing. So full brain leadership is what we're achieving with this archetypal model, what we're looking for. So my partner, Richard Olivier, who is Laurence Olivier's son, so he has that theater in his blood, and is he's a theater director and has been doing leadership development based on Shakespeare for the last 25 years. And we have partnered in this new model of work called Archetypes at Work. So here's the 10 archetypes. Again, they are directly related to the planets. So this is the sun, this is Saturn, this is the moon, and so on. But we call them archetypes because many organizations get a little strange when you start talking about astrology. So we have to sort of, find a model that they will be able to, I call that seducing the gatekeepers. I don't know if you can translate that, but I like the term, seducing the gatekeepers, to find a way that they will understand what you're saying. And so there's an assessment model that we have, a tool where you answer 100 questions and you get a printout of your archetypes. You get a sense of which am I comfortable with. So it's not like the Myers-Briggs. I don't like the Myers-Briggs for lots of different reasons, but it is an archetypal tool. It tells you all 10. And it says, okay, so this person here would be a developmental edge. To develop the nurturer more and the strategist more would help this person. And so now coaches go in and work with a leader or with someone in an organization and help them to do this horizontal development, get more comfortable with these archetypes that they don't know how to access very easily. They're very comfortable with the explorer, very comfortable with the lover, but not very comfortable with the nurturer. What does that mean? And then the other one would be the vertical development, where we know this explorer is really strong. So how do you want to work on this? Are you doing more of this? You want to downplay it a little bit, or you want to upplay your healer archetype? That's also part of the warrior. This is called Archetypes at Work, the model. There is a guild of practitioners. It's global now. We're in the 9 or 10 languages. There's people now all over the place. And if you're interested in this work, you can go to this website here under Guild and see how you become a Guild member and how you can learn how to use this in your own practice. So there's people who are, it's a community of practice. It's people who have learned how to do this, who are doing their own work, but come together to study more, to learn more, and to apply the work, and also find other people to do projects with them. If they go into a company, they need 5 people, they'll find them in the Guild. So it's a Guild of practitioners. There's a website there if you're interested in that. You can connect with me directly. I love this work a lot. Also the astrology work, anything you want to ask me privately, there's my private email. There's my personal website. Connect with me anytime, ask me questions, more things you want to know about this work. I will be glad to talk to you. We can even jump on Zoom if that helps. So I'm accessible and available. There's my personal email. That's it. So we did just about right on time. And now I would love to discuss this. Questions, pushback, anything you want to talk about.
Laurence, muito obrigado pela tua apresentação, né? Uma série de questões aí novas que você está trazendo para a gente, que acho que vai ser bom a gente poder ter um espaço aqui de troca, de debate. Pessoal, vamos seguindo então o modelo do Tiaços. Quem quiser fazer perguntas, vamos aproveitar a disponibilidade do Laurence. Coloque os nomes no chat, eu chamo e a pessoa faz a sua própria pergunta, tá? Laurence, eu queria começar com uma questão. Me parece que não há nenhuma dúvida que a gente vive uma época cultural, econômica, social, totalmente calcada naquilo que se chama do hemisfério direito, né? Do hemisfério masculino. Incremento da tecnologia, privilégio do capital, velocidade das relações. Aonde você encontra brecha nas empresas e nas instituições para que você possa apresentar essa possibilidade de trabalho? Quer dizer, aonde as empresas, vou usar uma expressão mais ou menos dessa maneira, aonde as empresas fazem sintoma para que você possa, nessa fresta que elas abrem, você poder entrar e poder oferecer a eles uma outra possibilidade de leitura dos fatos, dos acontecimentos, da própria empresa em si. Onde é que você identifica isso?
Two things. First, I have a very unscientific idea that about 10% of organizations in the world understand that they need this. 10% already have this, and 80% will never understand this in my lifetime. And they will either just continue the way they have, push through, they're strong enough or big enough, you know, too big to fail, as we say in America, and they will just continue, and they will either survive, or many of them are also just dying very quickly. Big companies are just disappearing overnight, or organizations in general. So I'm interested in the 10% who are smart enough to know that they need something different, and that what got them here is not going to get them where they need to go. That's the first part. Second part is that we find them by word of mouth. People talk. They say, hey, what are you doing in your company? A lot of leaders get together. We talk to leadership organizations. We've done this for a while, and so you start getting a reputation. Like my partner in with theater and Shakespeare and leadership has been working all over the world. So this is a new addition to that by having this archetypal language. And also, companies are suffering enough. There's so many huge problems that they're more open to something strange. It's like, we don't know what to do. Give us, we'll try anything. There's a little bit of that.
Uhum. Tá.
And it's a different business world. In the 1980s, I got an MBA, classic American Masters in Business Management, right? That stuff that I learned there really doesn't apply anymore to business. Sure, it does to finance and certain things and production and so forth, but not in the ideas about business or the big reason of why are you even in business and these kinds of questions. Those are philosophical questions that people are asking, and that young people are coming to work want to know. If you can't answer that, they'll leave.
Uhum.
And the size of the company doesn't matter. What we're talking about works for a company of 10 people or for any kind of organization. It's how people organize themselves into structures that has to change, and how they think about their interactions between each other. That's what we're working on.
A gente está falando aqui de alguma coisa que pode ser desde startups de uma geração bem mais jovem até empresas já consolidadas.
Yeah, anything. One company we work with has 140,000 employees. And I work with individuals who are just starting their business. So it's anything, any size. And now there's people in our guild who are working with psychedelics and archetypes, with leaders, and with AI and leaders and archetypes. There's all kinds of, it's going very fast into all kinds of directions, but it's the key idea of this model.
Uhum. Perfeito. Obrigado, Laurence. Vamos começar as perguntas, então. Priscila diz. Tá aí, Priscila?
Sim.
Tudo bem?
Olá, boa tarde. Tudo bem? Posso começar?
Fica à vontade, por favor.
Olá, Laurence. Muito obrigada. Sim, estou
I hear you.
encantada
I
com
see
a
you,
sua...
Priscilla. Hello.
Hello. Estou encantada com o seu conteúdo, com a sua palestra. Muito me encanta esse tema. Só que aqui no Brasil a gente percebe ainda muito preconceito, principalmente na área da psicologia, quando a gente fala sobre sobre astrologia arquetípica, uma astrologia mais simbólica, digamos assim. Só que é um trabalho que eu, no particular, eu percebo muita aderência assim, na minha clínica, principalmente para os clientes, né, ou pacientes, que também se identificam muito com essa simbologia, com essa linguagem, né, da astrologia. E eu queria ouvir a sua opinião, se você concorda em trazer o mapa natal, que seria o mapa radical da pessoa, o mapa do nascimento, porque tem muitos aspectos que o próprio cliente descobre, né, um processo de descoberta dele através dessa análise do mapa do nascimento. O que você pensa sobre essa abordagem? Obrigada.
Yes, so of course. The answer is of course. Famously, Rick Tarnas, one of the great astrologers of today, who wrote The Passion of the Western Mind and Cosmos and Psyche, great books if you haven't read them. Rick Tarnas has famously said, 100 years from now, a therapist who did not use a chart is going to be looked at as a charlatan, Like, why didn't you? That's a kind of a famous statement by an astrologer, but there's something interesting in that statement. Jung used charts all the time. Why would you not use the tool? As Jungians, you already know that most psychological clinics that you are talking about, I'm thinking you're talking about, are left brain clinics. They're behavioral, they are, behavioral psychology, they are, it works, really useful. If you have severe OCD, then Jungian therapy isn't going to do much good to you. There's absolutely a place for behavioral psychology and developmental psychology and everything like that. But it doesn't feed the soul. It's about changing behavior, which doesn't feed the soul. And so the same thing is happening in clinics that is happening in organizations. It doesn't feed the soul. I go to work, I do my job, I go home, I hate myself. Something is missing. What we need is a more ensouled psychology and a more ensouled workplace. One way we can get instant access and map this inner life is with an astrological chart. I'm not a therapist. I work with therapists. So I work I think of myself like in a hospital, the X-ray technician. I do the X-ray, right? I do the chart. I read for the patient goes to the therapist is the doctor. They do the work. But I read the charts to tell you what's broken here or what the archetypes are that you want to work on. And that's very useful for therapists. That kind of interplay is really, really good. I don't have to know somebody's complete life or why when they were 5 years old and this happened and they're now traumatized. I don't need to know that because I can see the archetypal pattern for that in the chart. And I'm more interested in what I'm going to do with that archetypal pattern than how I'm going to try to fix it or talk about it and not change anything. That's a big difference. It's very, very effective. And people today, 25 years ago, I had a client who wrote a book, was called The Coach Replaces the Couch. It was a clever title. Essentially, everybody today wants a coach. They don't want a therapist. They don't want to do 6 months, 9 months, 5 years of therapy because it's too expensive. They don't have time and they want it fast. So you can say, well, that's wrong. That's not how the soul works. Or you can stay in business and say, I'm going to adapt and talk to people and meet them where they are in this fast world. And so a tool that gets to the point faster, but still is depth psychological and deeply, deeply analytical is a very valuable tool. Absolutely, archetypal astrology does that, of course. So to me, a therapist who doesn't use a chart is spending a whole lot of time trying to understand things that you can understand with a chart like that. Because you understand them on the bottom layer of the cake. That's what we're reading. And then you can take it through the work of psychology and the behavior into how it actually, what it means for the person in their life. But if you don't understand the key theme, then you're missing something huge in my mind. It's a challenge because it's a different mindset, but you're not giving up any power. You are using the tools available to you. Thank you for the question. Does that answer your question?
Sim, muito obrigada, Laurence, pela resposta. Eu só queria complementar dizendo que eu achei muito bom você trazer o Saturno com a Lua, porque parece que quando a gente traz essa palavra ou traz uma interpretação do que o paciente está trazendo, uma problemática, um complexo, um conflito que ele está vivendo, parece que aciona algo muito profundo, a palavra Saturno com Lua. Parece que ali faz uma psicodinâmica diferente, é muito interessante. Muito obrigada.
Obrigado, Priscila. 2 perguntas. Vamos com a Luciana Ximenes. Quer falar, Laurence? Não. Então vamos lá. Lu, contigo. Depois a gente chama a Cristina.
Obrigada, Laurence, pela sua fala tão didática. Adorei. Eu tenho 2 perguntas. Eu acho que a gente pode fazer as 2 em uma só. Eu fiquei um pouco curiosa de como é que você aplica esse trabalho nas empresas, né? Qual é a prática de aplicar? É em grupo? É 1 por 1? Né? E juntando com isso, pensando na nossa prática clínica, né? Pelo que eu entendi, você propõe que isso também pode ser aplicado na psicologia arquetípica clínica, né? E aí me causa um estranhamento que eu queria compartilhar com você, que a gente é treinado na psicologia arquetípica a trabalhar com as imagens que os pacientes nos trazem, né? Então a gente vai aprofundar a imagem, vai se relacionar com a imagem, tarará. E o que eu estou entendendo é que você está sugerindo uma certa amplificação dessa imagem. Queria que você falasse, comentasse um pouquinho isso, por favor.
Yeah, the question, thank you. That's a great question. The question of amplification is an interesting one. So one of my favorite lines about what a therapist, an analyst does is from Marie-Louise von France. And she said, the analyst gets into the good analyst gets into the bathtub with the patient. There is vulnerability, there is nakedness, there is openness, there is connection. And it's not just the imagery that is activated in the patient, but it's just as important the imagery that is activated in you. What the symbolic language of astrology can do is activate imagery. Priscilla obviously knows something about astrology, and the words Moon and Saturn activated something in her mind. When I look at a chart, it activates something in my mind, gives me imagery. Sometimes it is the exact images that are in the patient's or in the client's mind, in some very strange way sometimes, a lot like Jung's story about the scarab. Synchronicity is what astrology really is. It's synchronicity. And so the imagery that is triggered in me from this symbolic picture is relevant to the conversation. I know that for a fact because I've done it for 46 years and I've seen it thousands and thousands of times. So it is a mutual getting in the bathtub together. That's what happens in a good session. And not every session is good, just like you can connect with all of your patients. I can connect with all of my clients. Some are better, some are not so good. That's just how it is. I mean, not so good is probably an overstatement, but some are better than others. And so how do we do? So that's the answer on that part of the question. The part of the how do we do it in companies is everybody who we work with in a company always starts with the assessment. They answer 100 questions, they get a 25-page report, they read it. Most people that I work with in companies have never, ever been talked to about anything around soul in business. They're like, they tell me, I heard it again and again and again. No one has ever talked to me like this at my workplace. In my 40 years of career of working in 6 companies, no one has ever talked to me like this. And they are so engaged, they want to jump into the screen. Almost everything in the initial contact is on Zoom all over the world. And there's people who work, you know, I'm thinking of this one big company we work with. So the guy from, you know, Nepal is working in Paris, and the guy born in Madrid is working in London. They're all over the place, but they work in teams. And so what we do is first we give them a personal experience. They get somebody who's trained by us, a certified debriefer who debriefs them on their report, spends an hour with them and explains what it means. They're not therapists, they're not analysts, they are simply trained to debrief them, and many of them are coaches. And they know how to talk to someone and explain this report. And they start getting them to think in a way that they've never thought before. Next, after that, they may be 20 people who work in a team together globally, who then come together in a room, in a physical room, with 2 people from us who are trained to do facilitation with archetypes, with our model, and put them through a 1-day or a 2-day or sometimes a 3 or 4-day workshop to activate certain things. Depending on the length, we will do things like, you know, personal coaching session with each person, or if it's only 4 hours, half a day, then it's much smaller. But people, the one thing about the theatrical language and what is different about this, there's another component I have not had a chance to talk about. What we do is also very, very physical. We understand the somatics of archetypes. And so we teach people how to embody these archetypes. If you want to learn more about your warrior, there's things you do, there's ways you speak, there's ways you behave, there's ways you act. Remember, my partner is a theater director. And so he's been with people in a rehearsal room for 25 years, practicing things. He directed plays at the Globe Theatre in London. He's been he's done productions, but now he works with leaders. And so we teach people an embodied language, not something that goes in here and then comes out here. It is fully embodied. And the training that the people go through to become a guild member is an embodied training. So it's 106 hours of really deeply getting into your body. It takes about 6 months. And so that's another important piece. And so we get people in a room to do embodied experiences with facilitation. So we teach both the coaching. Some people only work one-on-one and works with a particular leader who wants to develop a certain archetype. And others, like, people don't listen to me. I can never tell my story. Everybody walks over me. I got promoted. I don't know what to do. Okay, so we'll work with your storyteller and your sovereign so you can be more present, things like that. And in a team, it can be, a group problem that we work on. And what it does is it changes the communication, because people are no longer pointing a finger and saying, you're always so aggressive. Instead, they're saying, your warrior is getting a little bit too much for me. That changes the dynamics completely, because we're talking about archetypes and it's not personal. We're going down from the behavior down to the archetype. That's how they're talking. So they're learning what we call an embodied language. Does that answer your question?
Responde sim. Muito obrigada.
Obrigado, Lu. Cristina, com você, por favor. Fique à vontade.
Olá, boa tarde. Hello, Laurence. Eu quero dar um abraço para a Marta, que é minha colega de outros cursos, e eu quero fazer uma pergunta para o Laurence, e aí depois eu vou justificar a pergunta. A pergunta é se ele conhece o trabalho da Carol Persson e Margaret eu não sei falar o nome dela. Por quê? Porque aqui no Brasil tem uma moda de arquétipo, só que, na verdade, não é arquétipo, e de ativar o arquétipo. Por quê? Porque o arquétipo, por natureza, causa encantamento. E pessoa que nunca ouviu falar nisso, é como o Laurence mesmo falou. Me ajuda, por favor, diga quem eu sou. Então, aí entra coisa do arquétipo. O que eu entendo, eu sou bailarina, trabalhei com moda, então eu entendo muito essa questão do personagem. Me parece que a Carol Pearson trabalhou com treinamento de artistas, de atores, para incorporar o personagem. Então, eu entendo, até mesmo na astrologia, porque Saturno é Cronos, né? Vênus é Afrodite, então o arquétipo é o mito. Eu entendo esse sistema de arquétipo como, na verdade, a persona. Então, é uma persona, é um holograma, não é ativar o arquétipo, porque, na verdade, o arquétipo a gente nem consegue, a gente ia destruir o nosso ego, né? E também não é a imagem arquetípica. Eu entendo isso como persona. Então, o herói é um personagem, a mãe é um personagem. Então, a minha pergunta é, se ele conhece esse trabalho da Carol Pearson, porque aqui no Brasil eles estão embalando o produto de branding para vender arquétipo. Na hora que vende brand, construção de marca, fala o nome arquétipo, porque a maioria das pessoas não sabe o que é, causa encantamento, fica todo mundo doido querendo saber o que é. E se faz algum sentido para ele, esse meu raciocínio meio louco. É isso.
Thank you for your question, Christina. So, yes, I know Carol Pearson. I know her personally. I know her work quite well. And there are several differences between our work. She is the person who started a lot of the sort of more public way of thinking about archetypes. Unfortunately, her work has been stolen by a lot of people and made into really bad, sort of cheap marketing tools. And so she's been sort of plundered. But the big difference is that people use her work as a typology. And so they say, my brand is is an orphan. That's my brand. And so the difference in her model is how, first of all, there's 12 archetypes. And so my question is always, how did you come up with those 12 archetypes? Because they are her invention. It's her, and she's changed them over time. At one
Ainda
point,
fala que é 12 arquétipos de Jung. E Jung nunca falou isso.
right, exactly. Jung doesn't exactly. So but the 12 is that she made them up. I know that. I mean, she's changed them over time. 2 of them she changed into a different one about 4 years ago. And so the archetypal model that we use uses the planets, which, like I said, is the oldest model of archetypes that we have in the human psyche. They're 5,000 years old. There's no older science. So to me, that's the number one question, is where do you come from? But also, I think what she's doing is great, because she's activating the notion of archetypes, and I think that's great. But again, her stuff has been stolen and plundered, and I think she's very worried about that. I know that she's very worried about that. And so that's what I have to say about her. It's a different model, but also uses archetypes. It's also not at all specialized for organizations. Ours is specifically for leadership and for leadership change. The whole language that we use, how we train, is specifically to organizations. Hers is for personal development, different markets. And so does your language make sense to me? To some extent. You use a lot of big terms like the ego, the this, the that. My father always taught me, when you use a big term like that, like persona or ego, you have to know that everybody in the room has a different idea of what it is. And so define it as you do, which is why I defined all the terms that I was using. So it would take more time to know what exactly do you mean with persona, because we easily, especially in Jungian circles, we throw these things around, but what does it mean to you might mean something slightly different to me. So yes, I understand what you're saying, but I'm also imagining that I think I understand what you're saying because of the big terms that you use. Does that make sense, Christina?
Faz muito sentido, e foi um grande alívio a forma com que ele me respondeu, porque as pessoas, na verdade, estão, eu vou usar uma palavra forte, mas elas estão prostituindo todo o trabalho maravilhoso de Jung e do próprio pai dele, do Hillman, James Hillman. E quando eu falo persona, é baseada naquele modelo do teatro, triste e rindo, de personagem mesmo, sabe? Então, é nesse sentido. E também o cinema usa isso muito, né? O universo Marvel usa muito o guerreiro, o Capitão América, né? O guerreiro, e a heroína também.
Right, right. Yeah, that's another thing, is that I'm not a purist in that sense, that I don't think you ever see, because I'm so against typology, and because I always think all 10 archetypes are always present in everyone at any moment. We teach things like, what does a nurturer warrior look like? Or what does a lover explorer look like? Or what does a renegade storyteller with a lot of nurture in it look like? In other words, we talk about the 3 leading actors, who's leading the show, who's center stage. And then we have supporting actors. And then we have more offstage actors that we don't access comfortably for whatever reason. And so activation often comes because there's a price for having offstage actors. If you don't do the warrior very well, there's usually a price for that, because like I said, people walk over you. If you don't do the lover very well, then people don't like you, or they don't like to hang out with you. If you don't do the explorer very well, you're not interested in new ideas, and so on. So there are offstage actors and lead actors, is how we think about it in the theatrical model. If you want to know more about that, this is all explained in great detail in the book.
Thank you.
Obrigado,
Obrigada.
Cristina. Obrigado. Martinha,
questions?
contigo. Martinha, querida, você.
Oi, boa noite. Oi, Cristina, tudo bom? Obrigada, Laurence, pela palestra. Eu, assim, na verdade, eu não sei muito, realmente, muito pouco de astrologia, né? Realmente não. Mas, assim, me veio, assim, uma questão, né? Quando você falou do mapa astral, da coisa, o lidar, né, com as lideranças, com empresas, assim, caberia fazer um mapa astral da empresa, por exemplo, quando essa empresa nasce, quando ela, isso caberia no sentido de ver coisas ali, né, nessa, sei lá, na sincronicidade, né, entre o momento e o... Então, seria isso.
Yes. The answer is absolutely yes. And there's two ways to do it. And usually you interview people to find out what's better. One way is to look when a company was traded for the first time, bought and sold. So that's usually, if it's on the New York Stock Exchange in the United States, that's 9 o'clock in the morning when the stock market opens. That's its birth minute. That's the birth day. That's one way that it's done. Another way is for smaller companies, when the founder or founders go and get the paperwork. There's usually a seal, a timestamp. It gives you the date and time that it was born. It was officially a company. There's different ways to do it. I've used different methods, but mostly I will interview the owners or the founders if they're still there, or we'll do a constellation, systemic constellation to find out what the energies that's still there from the owners or things, or from the founders or things like that. But it's a great question, and absolutely you can read the chart.
Obrigada.
Laurence. Obrigado, Martinha. Laurence, queria fazer duas perguntas para a gente encerrar o nosso encontro. Tá? A primeira seria: você acha que a astrologia também pode servir como uma ferramenta de leitura, por exemplo, desse momento geopolítico que a gente vive? Ucrânia, Rússia, Israel, Palestina. É possível, através do que a astrologia nos oferece como leitura do mapa, leitura simbólica, ter também isso como uma ferramenta de compreensão desse momento agudo que a gente atravessa?
Yes. So let me answer this slightly larger. As an archetypal astrologer, when I step into the night and I look at the sky, the planets to me, in this model that I've been using, are performing a play. There's a big play going on in the sky at any given moment. Because I know what I know, I can read if that play is a comedy or a tragedy. What kind of a play is going on? That metaphor explains astrology really well, because it says what astrology does. A clock, I don't wear one, but a watch measures the quantity of time. What time is it, right? 10 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 6 weeks. It's a linear model of time. Astrology measures the quality of time. What kind of time are we living in? Is it a comedy or a tragedy above us? As above, so below. And therefore, we can understand the quality of any moment. When I read your birth chart, I'm reading the quality of the moment that you were born into. Which, if you read my father's book on the acorn, The Soul's Code, that moment contains the whole story, just like the acorn contains the whole tree. So that's what we're reading, is a moment in time that has a certain quality. So if I want to understand what kind of time we're living in right now, I can do that. There's plenty of astrologers that do that. Again, Rick Tarnas is maybe the most famous one who writes about this. Follow his work. The Passion of the Western Mind is a brilliant, brilliant, thick book that explains astrology and history back to the beginning, all the way up to, very recently. It'll explain all kinds of things that are going on in the world. I am never surprised at anything that happens. I'm shocked, I'm upset, but I'm not surprised. Because I live with this. Go ahead, Marcus, yes.
Não quer dizer que a astrologia possa ter uma função, é uma pergunta, né? Uma função profética, mas o céu não é isso. Mas ela ajuda a nos entender essa peça que está ocorrendo lá em cima e aqui embaixo, com outros personagens.
Okay, so here's and that's a great question. As above, so below. So I don't believe you can predict the future. I've said it, I've written it many times. Nobody can predict the future. Why? Because in a play, if you put two actors and they both have a sword and they're pointing it underneath each other's throats like this, that's the scene. That's what I'm seeing in the sky, right? But I don't know what that means. I don't know if they're going to kill each other or they're going to just say, thank you very much. This was exciting. Let's step back. We don't know what they're going to do, but we know that that tension is in that moment. And so when something happens, we can be shocked at that they actually stabbed each other and they actually went ahead and did it, but it's no guarantee. We know the tension is there, but there's a lot of different ways. This is the crap on the hand. What are they going to do with those two planets in tension? What are they going to do about that? That's choice. Often human beings choose the worst possible outcome. That's too bad. But there's plenty of examples of this, again, done by people who study what's called mundane astrology. So yes, absolutely, you can do that. Understand the current times and get a sense. Nothing ever surprises me in the world.
É uma bela ideia. Essa imagem de uma peça que ocorre nos céus é uma imagem muito poderosa para a gente poder imaginá-la e metaforizá-la. Laurence, queria fazer a última pergunta. Só um detalhe. O Richard Tarnas esteve conosco aqui no Teatro e foi muito proveitoso a presença dele aqui. Uma figura bastante importante para nós. Laurence, o nosso próximo convidado vai ser o Dick Russell, o biógrafo da vida do seu pai, do James Hillman. Ele gentilmente aceitou o nosso convite e sexta-feira que vem ele vai estar aqui para falar dos 3 volumes, né, dos 2 que já foram lançados, falta um que vai ser lançado em novembro. Hillman é uma presença muito forte para nós do Teatros, para o nosso grupo de psicologia arquetípica. Os grandes nomes da psicologia arquetípica e amigos dele passaram aqui pelo Teatro: Patricia Berry, Jeanette Paris, Edward Case, Mary Watkins, Robert Romanichin, Stanton Marlan e vários outros. Seria inevitável a gente fazer essa pergunta de como foi a influência do teu pai, qual é a relação do teu pai na tua escolha como astrólogo, como é que se deu essa presença do James Hillman na vida do Laurence Hillman?
Well, somebody said to me once, which I thought was a good description, you were marinated in archetypes, like marinada, marinated. And I think a way of thinking was mine that I learned through him. A particular way of understanding the world, a particular way of seeing, pushing the literal aside and seeing the archetypal eye, that I call that, how to have an archetypal eye. And there's many qualities that I bring to the table that he didn't have. He didn't have a good sense of business or organizations or structures the way I do and other kinds of things. So, of course, there's an influence, and I'm very glad for it. And I also have my own stuff that is not his. But it intertwines very nicely in this new work. And, Richard and I have this in common of having a bigger-than-life father. And we have a little club based on on Hemingway's book called The Sun Also Rises, but it's the sun with a, S-O-N. And so we understand each other on that level very well, of having, a bigger than life father. So he never became an actor because his father was the greatest actor in the world. I never became a psychologist because my father was who he was. And instead, I went a different route and went the astrological route, which I'm very glad of because it's much more applicable to the work that I'm doing now. But I'm also coming back full circle, and now I have a PhD in psychology, which I got after my father died. So, it's just, it's a full circle kind of a work. So he was very positive influence in my thinking, in a good way of thinking archetypally and being very careful with literalisms, very, very hesitant with any kind of literalisms or labels. And so the notion of thinking, but I also went to a Steiner school, a Waldorf school, which had a huge impact on my thinking, the mythology, the fairy tales, which is a big part of that. So there have been other influences that were very, very important to me. So all of it together. But Dick is a lovely man, and he did a really beautiful job with the book. And so you're lucky to have him.
Com certeza teremos. Estamos todos muito ansiosos e felizes dele ter aceito o nosso convite. Acho que a gente vai ter um belo encontro. Seu pai era ariano, né? E ele falava que tinha uma arte. Você falou muito do guerreiro hoje. Em vários livros ele fala do espírito marcial. É interessante pensar nisso. Mas olha, queria te agradecer, Laurence. Queria te agradecer pela tua.
We have to be. Hold on, time out. Because what you're doing now is what I push back against, because that's typology. There's no such thing as an Aries. There's no such thing as that's taking one of the 10 and one of the 12 signs and saying that's it, or you can't. And this actually gets me right into why I don't like the Myers-Briggs and why I don't like typology, because in every typology, let's say Myers-Briggs, simple model, there's 16 types. I'll make it very simple. I know there's all of that. As soon as I say I'm an INTFJ, I don't even know what I am, but let's say that's me. As soon as I say that, I am saying, and I'm not the other 15. I am different from you. This is completely the opposite to saying the human genome of the soul, what we have in common. If I say I'm an Aries, I'm therefore not the other 11 signs. Typology, separating. If I say, I'm a liberal, label on my forehead, I'm now separating myself from everyone who's not a liberal. Every typology, every grouping like that immediately causes tension, war, separation, and differences. This is the problem with every religion in the world. Because as soon as I say I'm this, I'm no longer everything else. And so I'm not talking about a generalism I'm talking about going beneath that behavior and some kind of a label underneath it and going to the archetypal level that we all share. This was Jung's great democratizing idea, which is that actually, no matter where you go in the world, everybody has the same inner modules and pieces, and we're just put together different ways. We play different music with the same notes. And so my father had the way I would say is my father had a strong central figure on his stage of the warrior. And he liked to fight and he liked to be in things. And yes, his sun and his moon sign were Aries, but he wasn't an Aries. He liked to play that part center stage. Big difference in thinking. That's what I'm getting at. Very, very important, because we avoid typologies and separating ourselves. I'm curious about which figures are active in a person. What's center stage in a person? What are they playing right now? Why are they playing that right now? Is it because it helps them, survive? Is it because whatever? And then I'm curious, what are they not playing so much right now? It's a different way of approaching than saying, okay, I got you in a box. Now I know how to talk to you. And some companies, even worse, do that. They say, well, we want this type, this Myers-Briggs type, to work in accounting, and this type to work in creative, and this type to work in marketing. That's horrible, because it emphasizes stereotypes of putting people in little boxes, and people don't want to be put in boxes. Believe me, Gen Zers, the new generation, you put them in a box and goodbye. Try just calling someone a boy or a girl. It's finished. No more boxes. Everything is fluid. This is the new world, and this language can meet that new world. That's my point. You already have a tool by being here that you can use to meet this new world that is fluid and that is everything at once and that can hold opposites at the same moment. These are right brain capabilities. That's your gift.
Laurence, então, só colaborando. Então, a gente pode pensar que esse nível arquetípico, ao chegar nesse lugar, a preocupação com as identidades perde a razão de ser, perde o sentido. Não é mais necessário afirmar uma identidade de maneira tão fixa, por assim dizer. A gente entra num campo mais disso que você chamou de fluidez.
Yes, agreed. And identities always separate because, you know, everybody's tribal and wants to belong to this little group. And it's very, very scary. A big part of the political movement back to authoritarianism is because it tells me where I belong. It puts me in this group and tells me who my leader is and, you know, puts me in a box. That makes me feel safe. The idea of being a global citizen or some kind of global political power is very, very scary to a lot of people for that reason, because it devoids us of everything that we connect with identity. You know, my identity is hung up in the fact that I am this or I am that. And that's a label and gives me certain security, like a bottle of wine. I know what I am. Not enough. And doesn't work in the modern world. All it does is talk about differences. And it doesn't, you see, we're not making a homogeneous human race. That's not the idea. We're just finding a language because what's interesting to me now is I can go to Brazil and I can say, I'm really curious, in your culture, how do women express the warrior? See, that would be an interesting question to me. If I came there for dinner, I would like to have this conversation. How do men express the nurturer? The lover? How is that in your culture? Typical. What happens? It's a different conversation because we're starting out with the fact that we all have the same. In my culture, they express it in a certain way, and in yours in a different way. Now we have an interesting conversation about differences. But we're not saying you are different and I am different. We're saying that your preferences of expressing an archetype is culturally strongly influenced. But we have in common the understanding of the archetype that's being expressed. That's the gift of this language, is that we can go anywhere and understand it because we can look through the archetypal lens and understand what is necessary. In an increasingly global world, this is really important. And the arts have always been the medium to do that because you can recognize archetypes in paintings and in art and in dance and in music and everywhere. And so, yes, Christina is nodding. As a ballet dancer, you find these are universal expressions that come through the artists. We also worked with actors in London on the stage. And, you know, you can walk across the stage as a Saturnine Henry V or as a Jupiter Henry V or as a Mars Henry V, and they're very different, but everybody recognizes the archetype that comes through. Because it's a universal, it's in our internal system already programmed, if you want to use that analogy. We get it. It's on our genetic level. We understand what it is when we see it. You'll never see the archetype, but you'll always see its expression. And so we call it the preferences. Our report that we do, we call it the preferences report, because we don't say that's who you are. Right now, you prefer this because this fits your life right now. And we have people who have typically, you know, at their core, very strong warrior. But right now, the warrior is kind of off stage because they don't need it very much because they're kind of settled. They're in their 60s and they don't have to fight anymore and, you know, different things. So the warrior, while they know how to do it, is not very prominent. So they have a preference. It's a different way of thinking about it than a label. You have choice. And also responsibility with that. You can't blame your parents in my model.
Perfeito. Perfeito. Melhor desfecho impossível. Laurence, obrigado.
Thank you.
Te
It's been a
agradeço.
pleasure.
Te agradeço, obrigado pelo teu carinho, pela tua gentileza em estar conosco. Espero que a gente possa te rever brevemente, seja presencial ou que você volte aqui no Teatro. Foi uma alegria imensa te ouvir, pensar com você, escutar tuas ideias, suas imagens. Muito obrigado. Aproveite sua noite parisiense, tá? Aproveite.
Thank you very much. And again, I gave you my email. If somebody wants to connect, continue the conversation, ask me questions. I don't speak Portuguese, but if you can manage enough English that I understand you, then let's keep the conversation going. I'm interested in this work and I'm passionate about it, and I love to share it with anybody who's interested. So take care.
O convite está feito pelo Laurence.
Good night.
Pessoal, obrigado pelo convite, pela presença. Sexta-feira que vem, dia 27, Dick Russell, biógrafo do James Hillman, vai estar aqui conosco para falar dessa imensa tarefa que é biografar a vida do Hillman em 3 volumes. Tá bom? Esperamos todos vocês. Isa, beijo, querida. Muito bom. Lúcio Menes, bom final de semana para todos. Até lá.
Obrigada, gente. Primeira vez
Tchau,
aqui com
gente.
você.
Obrigada.
Obrigada.